settle in, because we are about to embark on a long, winding journey through the lofty heights of the Swiss Alps, into a peculiar world both enclosed and expansive, a world where time stretches and contracts, and where life, death, love, and illness mingle in ways that defy simple explanation. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain is no ordinary novel. It's an epic tapestry of ideas, a coming-of-age story, a philosophical duel between conflicting worldviews, and a vivid snapshot of early 20th century Europe on the brink of profound transformation. In this summary, we'll follow Hans Castorp, a young man who arrives at a luxurious sanatorium in the Alps for a brief visit and stays for 7 long, transformative years. Brace yourself for a narrative of unexpected twists, deep character explorations, and simmering tensions that culminate in a haunting finale as we navigate Mann's masterful exploration of morality, culture, time, and human destiny. Our protagonist, Hans Castorp, is a thoroughly ordinary young German engineer, an everyman, if you will. Hans is not particularly ambitious, nor is he intellectually fervent at the start. He's just a genial, somewhat lethargic young fellow from a respectable bourgeois background in Hamburg. Raised by uncles after being orphaned at an early age, Hans is polite, mild-mannered, and comfortable with the routines of life. His decision to visit the Berghof Sanatorium in Davos, Switzerland, stems from a sense of familial duty and a mild curiosity. He plans to spend a mere 3 weeks visiting his cousin Joachim Ziemßen, who is convalescing from a lung ailment. Hans envisions a pleasant, restful stay, marked by leisurely chats, scenic mountain views, and perhaps some invigorating walks in the crisp alpine air. Yet from the moment he arrives, there's a subtle shift in Hans's perception of time and place. The Berghof, perched high above the world, isolated by both altitude and social customs, has a distinct rhythm. Its patients, men and women battling tuberculosis and other pulmonary illnesses, languish in lounge chairs on balconies, swathed in blankets, partaking in rich meals, and observing a meticulous daily schedule revolving around rest cures and temperature checks. This environment is strangely seductive. The whiteness of the snow-capped peaks, the rarefied mountain climate, the hush broken only by doctors' footsteps, the faint rattling of test instruments, and the eternal presence of death's shadow. All of this weaves a spell around Hans. Soon, the outside world below seems distant and irrelevant, and Hans senses that his 3 weeks might stretch indefinitely. Life at the Berghof is defined by a cast of characters who shape Hans's intellectual and emotional awakening. First, there's Joachim, serious and disciplined, who dreams of leaving this enclave of invalids to resume his military career in the flatlands. He is Hans's touchstone, familiar, stable, and yet increasingly troubled by the slow pace of his cure. Then there are the doctors. Dr. Behrens, the head physician, a somewhat eccentric figure with a taste for painting portraits of his patients, and Dr. Krokowski, the assistant who delivers mystical, psychoanalytic lectures in the Berghof's common room. Their presence asserts the medical authority that rules over everyone's time and prospects. Among the patients, 2 individuals quickly dominate Hans's mental landscape: the Italian humanist Lodovico Settembrini, and, later, the mysterious Jesuit-leaning Leo Nafta. In these 2 men, Hans encounters dueling voices that will engage him in endless philosophical and political debate. Settembrini, eloquent and humane, embodies the spirit of the Enlightenment, rationality, progress, optimism about human reason, and a belief in the liberating power of art and literature. He encourages Hans to view himself as a student in the International University of the Sanatorium, to learn from the intellectual ferment around him, and above all, to remain devoted to life, liberty, and the dignity of human striving. But Settembrini's influence is countered when Nafta enters the scene. Nafta is sardonic, ironic, and deeply critical of the modern liberal worldview that Settembrini cherishes. He represents a darker, more radical set of ideas. He justifies terror in the name of a transcendent cause, welcomes extremes of suffering if they serve a greater spiritual purpose, and rejects the bourgeois values that Settembrini holds dear. Between these two ideological titans, Settembrini's democratic, humanist optimism and Nafta's revolutionary, almost medieval, austerely spiritual intolerance, Hans finds himself caught in a kind of philosophical crossfire. Their arguments will swirl around him for years, forcing him to refine his own understanding of life's meaning, human culture, and ethical responsibility. However, it's not just lofty debates about reason and faith that tie Hans to the Berghof. There's another, more elusive reason he cannot tear himself away: the enchanting presence of Klavdia Chowchat. This beautiful, elusive Russian patient moves through the Berghof's halls with a feline grace. She arrives late to meals, her entrance heralded by the soft click of the door's glass handle, a sound that sends tremors through Hans's heart. With her sloping eyes and languid gestures, Klavdia represents an erotic and exotic presence that awakens feelings long dormant in the young man. Her appearance reminds Hans of a schoolboy crush he once had on a boy named Pribislav Hip, hinting at Hans's complex inner world of memory, desire, and identity. Klavdia is not a simple romantic figure. She is an enigma, at times warm and flirtatious, at other times distant and mocking. She drives Hans to distraction. He studies her handwriting, obtaining a pencil she once used, and even learns French in hopes of communicating with her more intimately. The simmering tension between them eventually culminates in a dramatic carnival night, a masquerade where patients momentarily shed the constraints of hospital routine. Under the influence of the festivities, the masks, and a stolen moment in a secluded room, Hans confesses his love to Klavdia. The scene crackles with intensity. The strange electricity of their encounter, the wordplay, the abrupt shifts in tone that veer between intimate confession and ironic detachment. Klavdia responds with teasing warmth, but also a sense of amused superiority. She understands that Hans is caught in the spell of this mountain world. Although she departs shortly after this confession, leaving Hans bereft, her presence lingers. Hans's affection for her will color his perspective, locking him emotionally to the Berghof long after he could have returned home. The 3 weeks Hans intended to spend become months, then years. Early on, Dr. Behrens discovers a suspicious spot on Hans's lungs and advises him to remain until it clears up, an indeterminate postponement that Hans readily accepts. Rather than feeling trapped, Hans grows strangely comfortable with this extension. Time in the Berghof acquires a dreamlike quality. Days blur into one another. Seasonal changes high in the mountains are subtle, and the routines, temperature checks, rest cures, lavish meals, give Hans's life a hypnotic rhythm. He reads widely, studies under the tutelage of Settembrini, and later, Nafta, and attends Dr. Krokowski's lectures on the connection between sickness, love, and the unconscious. Hans begins to regard illness not simply as a deviation from the norm, but as a profound state of being with its own logic and meaning. As Hans settles in, the world below, the flatlands, feels remote. He scarcely thinks of his former life as an aspiring engineer. Letters from home seem like messages from an alien sphere. He realizes that those down below measure time in days, weeks, months, looking forward to a future. Up here, time becomes malleable. The patients live in a permanent present, punctuated by occasional arrivals and departures, and by the ever-looming specter of death. Corpses discreetly vanish in the early morning hours, whisked away for burial. But these occurrences fail to break the spell. If anything, the proximity of death only intensifies the philosophical undercurrent at the Berghof. Life and death, health and sickness. These boundaries grow porous, and Hans begins to ponder the very meaning of existence. One of the most captivating aspects of Hans's prolonged stay is the intellectual wrestling match between Settembrini and Nafta. Much of the novel's narrative tension resides in their dialogues and debates. Settembrini, ever the bright, urbane Italian, seeks to nurture Hans's mind with ideals of progress, democracy, and reason. For Settembrini, life's ultimate purpose lies in continuous human improvement, the proliferation of knowledge, the pursuit of enlightenment, and the refinement of personal freedoms. He encourages Hans to think critically, to reject superstition, and to embrace the future as a stage for human advancement. Nafta, by contrast, explodes these ideals with biting wit and cynicism. A Jesuit-educated scholar, he unsettles Hans with arguments that glorify suffering, martyrdom, and the ecstatic embrace of death for a cause. He questions the value of humanism, holding that violence and radical upheaval may be necessary to achieve true spiritual transcendence. While Settembrini wants Hans to walk down the path of liberal humanism, Nafta tempts him toward a fascination with extremes, dogma, and the overturning of bourgeois complacency. Their arguments, often set against the backdrop of the snowy landscape or the quiet lounge rooms of the sanatorium, escalate into heated verbal sparring. Hans stands between these two polarities, absorbing their ideas, struggling to find his own intellectual and moral footing. Meanwhile, Joachim Ziemßen provides a poignant counterpoint to Hans's philosophical wanderings. Unlike Hans, Joachim never fully succumbs to the Berghof's enchantment. He longs to return to the regimented world of the Flatlands, to resume his military career. Yet each time he attempts to leave, his health falters. Eventually, he does break free and returns to the army, only to be sent back to the sanatorium in far worse shape. His decline is swift and heartbreaking. Joachim's death represents a crucial turning point for Hans. It lays bare the tragic consequences of this suspended life. Here, in the quiet hush of a Berghof room, Hans witnesses the extinguishing of a young man's future, a once vibrant soul who refused to accept the sanatorium's timeless cocoon. Joachim's passing confronts Hans with the reality of mortality in a way no philosophical debate could. Hans grieves deeply, and in that grief, he senses the moral weight of existence and the urgent need to find meaning amid the apparent aimlessness of this mountaintop world. Just as Hans emerges from his mourning and introspection, fate throws another surprise his way. Claudia Chauchat returns to the Berghof, and this time, she is not alone. She is accompanied by Meneer Peperkorn, a wealthy Dutch planter from the East Indies, whose larger-than-life persona dazzles the residents of the Berghof. Peperkorn is a commanding presence, boisterous, charismatic, and generous to a fault. He entertains the patients with lavish feasts and alcohol-laden gatherings, drawing everyone into his magnetic orbit. He is in many ways the opposite of the intellectual theorist Hans has grown used to. Peperkorn cares less for abstract debates and more for the immediate sensations of life, pleasure, fellowship, and direct emotional communion. He leads with his heart, his gestures, and a certain ineffable vitality that defies easy explanation. For Hans, Peperkorn presents a new puzzle. He is jealous of the intimate bond between Claudia and Peperkorn, Yet he cannot help but be captivated by Peppercorn's spirit. In fact, the rivalry Hans fears might erupt between them never truly materializes. Instead, Peppercorn invites Hans into his circle, treating him as a confidant and equal. This culminates in a tense, emotionally charged scene where Peppercorn and Hans spend a night together on the veranda, discussing existence with an emotional intensity that words alone cannot convey. Peppercorn tries to articulate his worldview, but often fails to find the precise words, ending his sentences in frustrated ellipses. His worldview is less a doctrine than a lived experience of vitality and emotional intensity. Hans listens, entranced, as Peppercorn stumbles to express the essence of life's grandeur and terror. Peppercorn's presence, however, is fleeting. Despite his robust persona, he too is a patient, and his vitality masks despair. Unable to reconcile his illness and the limitations it imposes, and perhaps tormented by his complicated relationship with Claudia, Peppercorn eventually takes his own life by overdosing on medication. This shocking turn of events jolts Hans and the other residents. Peppercorn's suicide underscores the limits of brute emotional force in confronting the existential crises posed by sickness and mortality. Even the largest personality can be undone by the quiet, insidious power of despair. For Hans, this loss is another painful lesson, another reminder that no philosophy, neither Settembrini's rational optimism, Nafta's radical fanaticism, nor Peppercorn's emotional immediacy, can fully shield a human soul from the tragic dimensions of existence. As the years roll on, the debates between Settembrini and Nafta grow ever more intense. What began as intellectual sparring evolves into a personal vendetta. Their arguments shift from philosophical exercises to deeply personal attacks. Eventually, in a climactic escalation, they challenge each other to a duel, an absurd yet deadly serious turn of events. Hans, who has thus far tried to absorb both men's teachings, stands horrified at how these defenders of opposing ideals are now willing to kill one another over matters of principle. The duel scene is tense and surreal. Two intellectuals, both sickly and ill-suited for martial heroics, stand with pistols in hand, poised to commit murder for the sake of proving a philosophical point. Settembrini, at the critical moment, cannot bring himself to shoot. Instead, he fires his pistol into the air, symbolically rejecting violence in favor of humanistic values. Nafta, however, is outraged by what he perceives as a humiliating moral capitulation, unable to bear the insult, and perhaps also unable to face the emptiness his ideology has led him to. Nafta turns his gun on himself and pulls the trigger. This tragic, dramatic act brings to a bitter conclusion the ideological rivalry that has haunted Hans's years at the Berghof. The philosophies that have swirled through these corridors, humanism, mysticism, radicalism, and rationalism, end in silence, in the quiet thud of a body hitting the ground. By this point, Hans Castorp has spent 7 years in the timeless world of the Berghof. He has witnessed love and jealousy, life and death, intellectual banter, and ultimate despair. He is no longer the naive, gentle visitor who first set foot on the mountain so long ago. He has become a man shaped by philosophical rigor, emotional intensity, and the haunting melodies of life's fragility. Yet the world outside has not stood still. Events are brewing in Europe. The Berghof's international community, Russians, Germans, Italians, Dutch, and more, has always hinted at the broader tapestry of early 20th century Europe. Now that tapestry is about to unravel. The year is approaching 1914, and the rumblings of the Great War loom large. Letters from below speak of political tension, mobilizations, and alliances. The fragile peace that allowed a place like the Berghof to exist in splendid isolation is shattering. Hans, acutely aware of the shifting tides, can no longer ignore the call of reality. The war breaks out, and Hans departs the sanatorium, descending into the chaos of a continent in flames. The novel's final vision of Hans Castorp is of him in the trenches, a soldier among countless others, caught in the mud and the din of battle. This sudden, jarring shift from the rarefied alpine retreat to the brutal immediacy of World War I starkly contrasts with everything Hans has known on the mountain. Up there, time was slow, life was debated intellectually, and death came quietly in hospital rooms. Down here, time is frantic, life is cheap, and death is a roar of artillery fire. Hans, the contemplative dreamer, now faces ultimate questions not as philosophical puzzles, but as matters of life and death on the battlefield. Thomas Mann leaves us with an image of Hans Castorp's fate uncertain. Will he survive the war? Will the ideas and insights he gathered on the mountain guide him now, amidst the horrors of modern warfare? Mann does not say. Instead, he leaves the reader with a lingering impression of Hans as a symbol of Europe's young generation, lost, searching, and sacrificed to the madness of the times. Throughout the Magic Mountain, one of the dominant themes is the malleability of time. In the sanatorium, days lose their conventional meaning. The routine of measuring fevers and taking rest cures creates a sense of eternal present, where patients exist outside historical time. Mann uses this temporal distortion to comment on the suspension of moral and cultural progress, hinting that Europe itself, in the lead-up to World War I, was living in a state of denial, unaware of the catastrophe soon to unfold. The novel also grapples with the interplay of life and death, health and sickness. Illness in the Berghof is not merely a medical condition. It's a philosophical and existential state. Patients seek meaning in their affliction, as if sickness grants some deeper insight into life's mysteries. Hans Castorp's own illness, a dubious diagnosis that keeps him bound to the mountain, is symbolic of spiritual malaise. He hovers between embracing the life-affirming stance of Settembrini and yielding to the death-embracing mysticism of Nafta. His heart also yearns for Claudia, whose presence symbolizes the elusive, erotic allure of life's deeper currents, even as it remains tinged with death and transience. The ideological battles in the book are not just abstract exercises. They reflect a Europe torn between Enlightenment values and reactionary impulses, between rational progress and the lure of violent upheaval. Settembrini and Nafta's ultimate fates, one retreating in moral horror, the other taking his own life, suggest that neither ideology can fully prevail. Reality, as embodied by Peppercorn's emotional immediacy and ultimately by the war's brutal facts, sweeps aside neat solutions. In the end, the Magic Mountain warns us that human existence is fragile and complex. No grand theory can contain all the nuances of life, love, suffering, and death. Hans Castorp's long sojourn reveals that understanding and meaning lies somewhere between these extremes, in the tension rather than in the resolution. The war, ironically, might be the crucible in which Hans must test the lessons he learned on the mountain, not through contemplation, but through survival. The Berghof itself is as much a character as any of the human figures. Its hallways resonate with hushed footsteps. The air is thin, scented with medicinal disinfectants and fresh mountain breezes. Windows open onto dizzying vistas of peaks and valleys, remote, pristine, and indifferent. The dining room hums with subdued conversation, the scrape of forks against plates, and the gentle clinking of glasses. Patients, bundled in blankets, recline on balconies and gaze at distant summits as if searching for metaphors of their own conditions. The atmosphere is at once serene and eerie, a tranquil facade covering a turbulent undercurrent of fear, longing, and unspoken desires. Mann anchors the novel's grand philosophical dialogues in this tangible setting, ensuring that the reader, or in this case, the viewer, can feel the cool alpine wind, the warmth of heavy woolen blankets, the mild discomfort of stiff lounge chairs. This sensory richness reinforces the emotional impact of the characters' journeys. When Hans experiences heartbreak, the silence of the mountain seems to amplify it. When Settembrini and Nafta argue, the crisp air and hushed corridors seem to hold their breath, as if nature itself were listening in. As viewers of this retelling, we feel Hans's confusion and fascination, his yearning for Clavdia, his grief at Joachim's death, his perplexed admiration for Peppercorn, and his distress at Nafta's final act of violence against himself. We too become patients of sorts, removed from the world below, caught in an enclosed community where ideas clash and hearts break, wondering what it all means. And when war finally calls Hans back down from the mountain, we sense the abrupt end of an era, as if we were awakened from a long, strange dream just in time to see civilization shatter. The Magic Mountain does not hand us easy answers. Instead, it invites us to dwell in the uncertainty, the complexity, and the richness of human life. Hans Castorp's time on that mystical peak shows that intellectual growth, moral insight, and emotional maturity emerge from prolonged confrontation with opposing ideas, with desire and disappointment, and with the stark truth of mortality. The book challenges us to reflect on the meaning of education, the role of tradition and progress, the seductions of stasis versus the demands of engagement, and the inescapable fact that history will, sooner or later, summon us from our retreats into the storm of reality. For a general audience, the story of Hans Castorp's extended stay at the Berghof Sanatorium is both deeply personal and broadly universal. On the personal level, we watch a young man discover love, heartbreak, intellectual passion, and disillusionment. On the universal level, we witness Europe's cultural and moral dilemmas on the eve of World War I. Mann's masterpiece, thus, serves as a time capsule of a vanished world, a meditation on the forces that shaped the 20th century, and an invitation to contemplate our own values in the face of uncertainty. By the end of this journey, Hans Castorp remains something of a mystery, a soul set adrift in an era of chaos. But maybe that's precisely the point. In a world where certainties crumble, where competing philosophies fail to definitively conquer our hearts, we must navigate the slopes of our own magic mountains with courage, empathy, and an openness to what lies ahead. The Magic Mountain beckons us to reflect, to question, and ultimately to embrace the full, daunting spectrum of human experience.